We all know the narrative around the career of Shaquille O'Neal. He was the most dominant big man to ever play the game. But if he had a work ethic like Kobe's, he could have been the greatest of all time, and would have even had a couple more rings. Listen, this is all obviously true to an extent, but it's definitely overblown. And this is the narrative that people use to knock Shaq off all-time lists. First of all, he had a top 3 peak of all time, and it's not all that debatable either. To me, his championship runs are only bested by Jordan and LeBron, who by most metrics and the eye test are the top 2. And I think a top 3 peak really should matter when making all-time rankings. I know everyone agrees that the Diesel was unstoppable during his prime, but somehow his performances are still weirdly underrated. He really terrorized the league like few ever have. So the main narrative against him lies on how he wasn't able to keep his prime going on for longer. However, he still had as many productive years as many players usually ranked ahead of him all time. Take Bird, Magic, and Hakeem for example, who all had around 10 years of their standard of production, but don't get the Shaq treatment. Even Jordan took a couple years off in his prime and doesn't get the longevity argument like Shaq does. And I'm not saying any one of these greats should get that treatment, it's just that Shaq is the only one that does. This is maybe because Shaq's prime was cut partially because of his own decisions. While Bird had the back issues, Hakeem had a knee injury, and I don't know if we can call Magic's issues self-inflicted. Still, O'Neal is treated like a what-if when his actual career holds up. This is maybe because of how underrated his years before winning a championship are, especially the ones on the Magic. For starters, he had one of the best rookie seasons ever, sliding right into the greatest big man era of all time at 20 years old, averaging 23.4 points, 13.9 rebounds, and 3.5 blocks, and taking the Magic from 21 wins to 41. Then in his second year with a rookie Penny Hardaway, Orlando would achieve their first 50-win season, led by Shaq's 29, 13, and 3 blocks. But like he said before, 21-year-old Shaq struggled against Rick Smits in his first ever playoff series, where his Magic would get swept by the 5th-seeded Pacers in the first round. But the next year, a 22-year-old Shaq won his first scoring title with pretty much the same numbers as the year before. And the Magic would go on to have the number 1 ranked offense and the best record in the East. Horace Grant's arrival to this team really was a game changer, and Penny Hardaway would take another step in his second year in the league. So as soon as Shaq had another All-Star with him, the young Orlando Magic would reach the NBA Finals, after becoming the only team to beat the Michael Jordan-led Bulls in the 90s. We all know the narrative that MJ had just come back from baseball and wasn't in basketball shape, which really only started being talked about after they lost to the Magic. No one questioned Jordan's shape when he dropped 55 in the Garden right after coming back, or 48 against the Hornets one round before losing to Shaq and the Magic. And he still put up his numbers in this series against Orlando, but without Dennis Rodman yet, the Magic were just flat out better. The Bulls would come back the next year and sweep the Magic in the conference finals. But what no one seems to mention is that Horace Grant got hurt in Game 1 of that series, and he'd maybe been their second most important player the year before. Listen, I'm not saying the Magic beat the 72-win Bulls, but it's definitely a different series with Horace on the court. Like if Nick Anderson doesn't miss those free throws and the Magic win Game 1 against the Rockets in the finals. The point is that those Magic teams have really become underrated. That starting 5 really had no weaknesses, and Shaq was one of the best players in the league from the moment he got drafted in '92. But besides the insane numbers, I really recommend that you go watch some footage from young Shaq. He had much more of a Giannis-like build with a refined postgame as the era demanded, but he could run the break like a Greek freak and still dominate in the half court. The original decision would come in the summer following their defeat at the hands of the Bulls, as Shaq would join the Lakers in the offseason to compete in a very tough Western Conference, which had the original Lob City in the Sonics, the old Big Three in Houston, and the most complete Jazz team to surround Stockton and Malone in years, who would beat Shaq and the Lakers 2 years in a row with the famous Kobe airballs. Then as favorites, LA would get swept by the Spurs in '99, which really seemed like the nail in the coffin for Shaq, as his off-court endeavors didn't sit well with the fans at all. Most thought he wasn't taking the game seriously enough to be the best player on a championship team. Then he would surpass everyone's expectations and lead the Lakers to 3 straight titles. And before the Kobe stands go crazy, I'm not going to attempt to belittle Kobe's contribution to the three-peat. Especially from the second title on, Kobe was one of the best players in the league, and rewatching the three-peat, I was genuinely surprised by how many big shots he hit. What people usually ignore though is that the Lakers supporting cast really started deteriorating as Kobe got better. They had Glenn Rice and the last good year of Ron Harper in the first title, and by '03, Slava Medvedenko was the third guy in their series loss to the Spurs, where they were one bounce away from going back to Staples Center with a 3-2 lead and maybe winning 4 straight titles. But then again, these are the 50-50 plays that went their way, especially in the first and third title. Regardless of how good and clutch Kobe was, any argument against Shaq in the three-peat really has no basis. During the last 2 years with the Lakers in 03 and 04, the dominant prime performances weren't coming every night anymore for the Diesel, as injuries and poor conditioning started taking a toll on 30-year-old Shaq. But regardless of all the turmoil inside the locker room, LA was still a contender, and Shaq was still capable of having those great nights in the playoffs relatively consistently. Like I said before, the Lakers weren't that far away from getting out of the West in 03, where they would have played the Nets team that they had swept the year before in the finals, who had no answer for Shaq at all. And then in 04, the Malone injuries and Kobe's trial really hurt that team's chances. But Shaq was probably still the best player in that finals, where he was pretty close to his best self. However, the Pistons were the better team. Still, this series might have my favorite Shaq game of all time. In Game 4, he had a dominant performance despite the chaos inside the team. He put the age and the injuries aside and just started demanding for the ball in the post and went to work on the greatest defensive team of this century. He would then get traded to Miami, where in his first year he was a close second in the MVP race to Steve Nash, which still upsets the Diesel to this day. And in the playoffs, they lost in the Eastern Conference Finals to the Pistons in a 7th game that really could have gone either way. Because the Heat would go on to win the championship the next year, people don't talk about that D-Wade injury in 05. He couldn't play at all in Game 6 and played hurt in Game 7, which still went down to the wire. Despite his injuries ramping up right after the three-peat, Shaq was still one of the best players in the world and an MVP caliber player until that second season in Miami in 05-06, where he really gave the reins to Dwayne Wade and was the second best player on that title team. Then it really started falling off after his 4th ring. But again, this is 14 seasons in, which rivals every great player except Kareem, LeBron, and maybe Tim Duncan. But look at everyone else that is typically in top 10s, and the longevity argument really doesn't stack up against Shaq. Like I said in the beginning, could he have been better? Yeah, definitely. But a top 3 peak of all time, alongside 13 real Shaq-like seasons where he was mostly the best player on contending teams, constantly in the MVP race, and even in the mix for the scoring title, should matter. Yeah, he struggled defending pick and rolls and was never the rim protector that Duncan, Robinson, or Hakeem were. But he was certainly a positive defender and a much superior offensive force. He was a better passer with great hands that could control every aspect of the game like few ever could. The truth is that despite remaining as famous as ever, the Diesel has somehow become an underrated player. But he has the rings, the numbers, and so many clutch moments that go under the radar simply because big men aren't considered clutch. And as much as the narrative goes against it, Shaq had longevity. He could have been better, but still to me, it is not outlandish at all that he's knocking on the door to be a top 5 player to ever play the game.